Greetings, namaste, and welcome to Astrology Awakening, a special eclipse edition for a solar eclipse that will be happening April 2022, and a lunar eclipse will be happening 2 weeks later in May, and these will be followed, as are all eclipses, by another set of eclipses 6 months later occurring in the same sign. So in this video, I will discuss how, why, where these eclipses affect our lives, and what are eclipses, because I honestly couldn't tell you unless I had astrology. Every time I hear a scientific explanation of an eclipse, I sort of eclipse. So one of the first things an astrologer will tell you about an eclipse or retrograde or any sort of significant karmically related event in astrology is the best remedy is do nothing. Chill, meditate, and this is especially true around an eclipse. In fact, one of the greatest pieces of advice, which I'll lead with around eclipses, is to practice yoga, especially Kriya Yoga. And if you don't know what Kriya Yoga is, one of my first vids I was doing some Kriya moves. It involves a lot of repetition and breathing exercises, and the idea of doing these around eclipses is to sort of harmonize with what eclipses are, which are trigger points for reboots. I mentioned in another video how Rahu and Ketu moving into Aries and Libra respectively were going to give a natural reboot to the world, globally, locally, and otherwise, because Rahu moving into Aries is the first house naturally, and this is going to bring about an energy of initiation and action. And since Rahu and Ketu are the reasons why eclipses are caused, this shift around Rahu and Ketu moving zodiac signs in March, April, being immediately followed by an eclipse, you're going to get double trigger points. You're going to get double initiations. And that's why, especially during this period of an incredibly active zodiac, it's very key to maintain cool posture, equipoise, try to balance within imbalance, and come out the other end all the better for it. I am not even going to try to talk about the scientific explanations for the ecliptic and the Earth casting a shadow on the sun and the moon and all that. It's above my pay grade as any kind of a researcher. But talk about dragons and squirrels swallowing the sun, and you've got my attention. So let's talk about some ancient mythologies and their ideas behind eclipses, because that's definitely at the heart of why we, as a society, have such a intrigue by eclipses. Going back to ancient times, let's start with the Norse. They depict two wolves known as Skol and Hati, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing those right, but go with me. They were hungry for the stars. They wanted to eat. The eclipse basically is where Skol and Hati devour the sun. This was an omen of Ragnarok, or the apocalypse. In general, that's what eclipses tend to signify, are omens, portents. In many, many cultures, it was the king's death, actually, that would be signified by an eclipse. So when you actually look at the Egyptians, for all of their interest in the celestial bodies, they don't mention eclipses that often, and one of the reasons why might be this negative stigma associated with the king's death. So you want to keep all that information on the DL away from the public. The Chinese actually have a very similar story to my most familiar, which is the Hindu mythology of Rahu and Ketu being the dragon beheaded. So the Chinese believe it's a dragon devouring the sun, very similar to what the Hindu Vedics believe. And I mentioned the squirrel eating the sun. They believe that's Choctaw. In ancient mythologies, you'll have various animals depicted as being the agents of taking the sun out of the equations. Like I said, the first advice an astrologer will give you is around an eclipse, try and limit what you do from a productive standpoint, or don't expect a lot of productivity. So, of course, as a devout field researcher, I'm doing this drop on the eve of the solar eclipse, and we'll be posting it the day of. So, we'll see what happens. Actual practical steps of an eclipse. Moon being either in a new moon state or a full moon state, either conjunct, which means in the same zodiac sign, or mutually aspecting the sun, which means looking across the zodiac. This will create the circumstances for an eclipse. But, of course, an eclipse doesn't happen every time the moon and the sun become conjunct or go across from each other. It's Rahu and Ketu, the north and south nodes of the moon, that actually cause the eclipse. Why? First of all, Rahu and Ketu, I've mentioned, are invisible. They're ghost planets, energetic signatures perhaps of celestial bodies that had been destroyed, or perhaps are coming into existence through another timeline dimensionally. Who knows? But we do know that they're invisible, and yet we can still see them with certain technologies. So, for instance, UV has picked up Ketu. There's a signature that is certainly observed by science, and then in the ancient times they were able to observe it too. So this is why Rahu and Ketu are truly the most fascinating and bizarre concepts of astrology, and hidden from most people because they aren't studying through these particular optics. Eclipses, of course, as I said, trigger, they reboot something. The reboot is going to happen shortly after 5 planets move zodiac signs and Rahu Ketu move zodiac signs. So we're going to have a partial solar eclipse and then a total lunar eclipse 2 weeks later. Now, what's even more fascinating is what happens 6 months after this, which is what I really wanted to get into in this drop. Anytime you have a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, those effects are going to be felt at different points, depending on where these eclipses are happening in your zodiac chart, and also depending on the factors having to do with other planets transiting at that time. So if you're interested in getting a reading based on eclipses or based on anything, in homage to my guru, KRS, Kapiel Raj, click the subscription below, or email me at this. I don't know how he does this, but we'll figure it out. Another great astrologer, Camilla Sutton, she talks about correlating the sun, how long the solar eclipse lasts, minute-wise, to how many years the effects will be felt. I've heard a lot of different interpretations of how a solar eclipse will produce its results over time, and it's usually not going to be immediate. The lunar eclipse, however, will certainly give you a result based on where it's transiting in your chart around that day. From a nakshatra standpoint, let's look at how these eclipses might unfold. So the solar eclipse is going to happen in Bharani Nakshatra. And Bharani is a nakshatra of Yama, the god of death. He's also the god of judgment. This was a god that Indra had to have help him when he took the power seat from Varuna, because Indra didn't have all the powers that Varuna had. He had to sort of have some co-gods help him out. And Yama, being in Bharani, is very much known for judgment, casting final judgment, as the god of death would. And so when you have a solar eclipse happening in this nakshatra and the zodiac sign of Aries, where the sun gets exalted, we're going to have government shifts. We're going to have everything that the sun represents, which is power and authority. We're going to have ripples of shifts starting in the next 6 months. In the lunar eclipse will happen in the nakshatra of Vishaka, which is part of Scorpio and Libra. This is another cusp nakshatra. In this case, this is Libra's portion of Vishaka. And Libra, of course, I've mentioned in other videos, is where Ketu is transiting now, and is the natural 7th house, which rules relationships, interpersonal dynamics, business arrangements, anything that would involve you and another person. Libra will have something to say about it. This is why Vishaka is such an important nakshatra to understand how we relate as people. It's about conjoining, and it's also about splitting. Vishaka wants a good arrangement, a good agreement, but it's also going to want the best for itself in some way. So this is where we get into the politics of interpersonal relationships, of romance, of whatever it is that love language means to you. This is going to be a big reset and reboot for a lot of these people who have significant Libra, significant Vishaka in their charts. Now, let's get into the timeline of the eclipses and how these might feed into each other in the next 6 months. So the first eclipse is the solar eclipse that happens on April 30th. This will be followed a couple weeks later on the 15th or 16th, depending on where you are in the world, by a lunar eclipse. 6 months after this, we have a solar and lunar eclipse that happen in October and November. And the one that I really want to point people's attention to is the November eclipse, which happens to fall on the exact date of the elections in America. So this midterm election cycle is very key to determining the, I would say, the path forward, not just for our country, but for the world in general. And I don't think that I can understate how much the nakshatras that I mentioned, Bharani and Vishaka, setting this up for judgment, for separation, for the splitting and reconjoining of polars, of polarities, of opposites. People who have not gotten along potentially finally seeing each other's point of view. This is my greatest hope for how these eclipses will reverberate in time. How they might actually affect the day-to-day, we'll just have to wait and see and hope for the best. And again, if you are interested in finding out how these affect you specifically, or any other quotient of your astrological makeup, of the MRI of your soul, which is what I call the astrology chart, hit me up, astrologyawakening, protonmail.com, and let's chat about it.